Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to reflect on your word. We stand on the shoulders of so many soldiers in your kingdom that have worked so hard to maintain and preserve your witness through the ages, and all the scholars that have come one after another that have sorted through all that material and preserved it for our reflection. And so, Father, we just thank you for their work, and we thank you for your superintendence over all that work so that we could be sitting here centuries and even millennia later reflecting on what was written. And Father, tonight we just ask for a special illumination from your Spirit as we take on this difficult subject of the possibility of other gospels and the context of the world in which we live now, where so many folks are looking for truth in so many places, and this new, which is not really new, speculation about other truths are creating such confusion among believers as well as in the world, so as to discredit your authentic witness. And so, Father, we just ask for wisdom and patience and even mercy as we think about folks wrestling through these subjects. And we just ask that, as always, your Spirit would be the guide and that we would think your thoughts after you. In the name of Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. All right. Well, if you were here last week and suffered through the storm and came anyway, we kind of turned a page in our study from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and we looked at the subject of the Gospels, the integrity of the Gospels. And we looked through a lot of historical evidence, documentary evidence. What are the earliest copies of the Gospels that we have? What are the witnesses in the early church to the way the Gospels were put together? What kind of proof do we have, or what kind of logic do we have that would suggest that the Gospels that we have, the four Gospels that are included in our Bible, are authentic witnesses and the primary witnesses to truth? And so we walked through all that material last week. And so now what I want to do this week is to turn the page and look at some other candidates that in contemporary literature at least, and obviously for centuries before this, but certainly in contemporary literature, there have been other gospels promoted. There's been several popular books as of late from various scholars that have suggested that what we really have is other gospels that politically that for political reasons were not allowed into the Bible. So I want to take that argument on tonight by looking at some of the evidence, and I also want to acquaint you with some of these other gospels. So again, if you're in conversation with others out there, you'll have some exposure. So it's quite a lot of material. I'll try to get through it as much as I can and still allow time for questions. So that's this week. And then I think there's one more week left in our class together next week. The week after that is Thanksgiving week, so we won't be having Crosspoint. That will be because we have our Thanksgiving service on Thursday. So this week and then next week we'll do translations. How do we get from these ancient texts to our modern English version? But first tonight we'll look at the possibility of other gospels. I just want to take you back for a text we looked at last week, just to remind you that we do know, in fact, the Bible itself says there were other accounts. And Luke himself points this out in the opening verse of his gospel. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us." So we do know that there are other gospels out there, and the word many seems to suggest more than 3 additional people, and we have 4 gospels, so we do know that there were other gospels around. The truth is we don't have any of the others except for the 3 that are included. At least that's the traditional assumption. But some folks have looked at this and have argued that we do have some of these other gospels. They do exist out there. And so tonight what I'd like to do is look at some of those other claims and ask the question, can there in fact be other gospels out there that for one reason or another were not included in the canon? So I said that it's kind of recent in some regards, kind of a resurgence of this theory. You remember a couple years ago when Dan Brown put together the Da Vinci Code here, and we have to be careful because he's one of our neighbors, right? So he put together this text, and it was a fictional book, so there was always a question of how much was knowingly fictional and how much it was believed. In any case, there's one of the characters in there that made this statement in the text that I have up there on the text for you. More than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, yet only a relatively few were chosen for inclusion. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John among them. So this was the guy that got all the fire for suggesting that these other Gospels were, for political reasons, kept out in the New Testament and were included in them. So just to point out that there is this popular theory around, and as I mentioned, I think in previous lectures, all you have to do is watch any PBS or History Channel story about the writing of the New Testament, and they all pretty much subscribe to the same belief, that there were other Gospels out there, and yet for political reasons of some sort, only these 4 were included. So that's the popular claim. You should know that this popular claim is based upon some academic, there is an academic community out there for some time that's been arguing this point. Kind of the person behind a lot of this in contemporary culture, at least one of the scholars that's been able to break through kind of the academic side and has been out there in the public media doing this stuff, is Elaine Pagels. You may know her and read some of her books. She was actually on the Colbert Report, so we're really getting cultural here. She kind of, on a popular comedy report, she's been on there. So she's kind of one of these scholars that have done the crossover. And I just put a quote in here. And she says quite explicitly in her book on the Gospel of Thomas that those who later enshrined the Gospel of John within the New Testament had denounced Thomas's Gospel as heresy, decisively shaped and inevitably limited what would become Western Christianity. And so what she is arguing essentially is that what you and I think of as Christianity, as the Orthodox view of Christianity, was totally an accident of the people that were in power at the time. So I guess let me just back up for a moment, because what I'm suggesting to you is there's a large academic community out there that has been arguing this fact for some time. And just to give you a little bit, I don't want to wear you out with scholarship, but I just feel like I need to present some sort of historical kind of framework for this in terms of academia, because again, outside of evangelical seminaries, this is the stuff that's taught. And you can really trace this back, if you want to, all the way back to some of those scholars that we talked about in the 19th century began to suspect and began to deconstruct, if you will, the scriptures, assuming that some of these scriptures were older or were more recent than they pretended, and that some of the books that were not written by the people that we are told that they were written by. And so what happened with regard to the New Testament is that when you get into the kind of the 1930s and so forth, there's a whole new kind of undertaking there that began to deconstruct the New Testament. A fellow by the name of Walter Bauer started it, and basically the assumption that he began to put out there, and that was generally accepted among scholars, those liberal scholars at that time, was that what you have in the Gospels is really not an accurate historical document. What you have in the Gospels is really a speculative kind of theology. It was a cultural document that none of the books written in the Gospels were actually written by the apostles. They were written by someone later, and so they were all later interpretations of the meaning of Jesus. And so there's kind of a disbelief that there's anything actual historical in those 4 Gospels. They're actually just reminiscences and interpretations of what the Gospel might be. So that was kind of the assumption there in the liberal heady days of the 1930s, when we assumed that we could just push all authority aside and just make these, just kind of invent, if you will, what the story was about. And so after Bauer, so many different scholars came along, and they began to essentially discredit all the historical claims of the New Testament, suggesting they were written much later, and that what we had was this reconstruction. It kind of culminated in this person by the name of Rudolf Bultmann in the 40s, who basically argued that there is really no historical value really to the New Testament Gospels, and what you need to do is seek through and see if there were maybe original sayings of Jesus that somehow got captured. And if we could really peel away kind of all the bad skin of the onion, we could get down to the kernel maybe of what maybe some of the pithy sayings that Jesus may in fact said. And so that kind of became the scholarship of the liberal kind of thinking throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when many of these folks like Pagels and so forth kind of grew up in that context of seminaries like Harvard, like Princeton, that began to accept some of these thinkings. Princeton a little slower, it kind of was slower accepting them, but Harvard was quick and some of these others. And so you have a lot of folks out there like Elaine Pagels and Karen King and some of these other folks that are out there that kind of grew up in that liberal theology. And so the assumption there is that the Gospels really have no historic value, that they're essentially written later, that they really don't bear any direct witness to the historical Jesus. They're just interpretations of an early Christian community. Now, as soon as you make that statement, as soon as you make that assumption, then you can start looking at some of these other Gospels that are around, some of these other documents that are around, and you can begin to believe that they're just on par. So if you assume that the Gospels that we have in our Bible were just kind of subjective interpretations of Jesus with little historical value, then why wouldn't they be placed along other subjective interpretations of Jesus? And so they create this environment in which there are all these different Christianities, different Christian approaches that kind of get batched together and compared. And so what they try to argue is that there isn't like an Orthodox Christianity and a heretical Christianity. They're just different kind of Christianities that we should just understand and accept, and just realize that the Orthodox view that you and I hold was just an accident of politics. Obviously, I'm going to address that as we walk through this, but I just wanted to let you know, where are these academic claims coming from? How could somebody just out of the blue began to make these kind of comments and these kind of claims with regard to the New Testament? Did they just wake up one day and reject it? No, there's been a long tradition in the scholarly community that have kind of rejected the historic value of the Gospels, if you will. Just a couple names in the notes that I kind of provided to you. Elaine Pagels is kind of the most popular one that you know. You may know Bart Ehrman. He's another one that comes up and pops up from time to time on some of the shows. He's kind of a young phenom down at UNC, and he just pops up a lot on debates and a lot of shows just discussing that. He's an interesting character if you read through him. He was actually an evangelical Christian that kind of went to a more of a progressive seminary and eventually decided the liberals were right, and he just wrote off his evangelical heritage and just kind of went over to the dark side, if you will. He would object to that, I'm sure. But the only reason I say that is because he uses that as part of his debate. I mean, if you read any of his books or listen to any of his debates, he's very quick to point out that he started off in that camp and scholarship convinced him to move over to the other side. So he's an interesting character. Helmut Kester is the other person I quote here, a German fellow. He's actually one of Pagel's instructors. She kind of followed in his tradition, and you may see some writings of his out there that make this statement. The other interesting, colorful guy that you'll see on a lot of PBS specials from this is a fellow by the name of Dominic Grosson. He's an interesting character. He's from, I don't know if you remember back in the 80s, late 80s, there was this movement called the Jesus Seminar. And if you remember back there, a fellow by the name of Robert Funk, I think I put his name in here, their whole theory was to go back and find, again, this historical Jesus like in between and behind some of these other sources, because the Gospels as we have them are not reliable historic witnesses. So the whole movement was to go behind them and look around to see if somehow we might get back to a historical Jesus behind all of this. So I just wanted to give you some names out there so that as you're on the internet and watching PBS and they bring up these quote experts to tell you about what happened in the New Testament, when you see those names, you'll have a little handle to say, whoops, a little yellow light would blink. And I will just tell you, I spent some time in academia. I got my PhD in historical theology from Drew University, and I started down that track. Published a little bit here and there, not enough to make any money on it. But I started teaching. I did some adjunct work, and I got to tell you, I'm now a minister of the gospel unapologetically, and I'm just more comfortable here. I found, while there are many good people in academia that I miss and enjoy conversing, there is kind of a switch where truth is kind of up for grabs. There doesn't seem to be always a real devotion to finding truth. It's kind of like a free-for-all speculation kind of political ego-driven machine out there. And these are my own subjective opinions, but I just wasn't comfortable there. There didn't seem to be a real interest and quest for truth. It was more about, just a platform to speculate and join other people in it. And I just kind of got frustrated with it. But so, I'm a little skeptical about the word scholars, and I'm less impressed than maybe I used to be with pedigree, because so I don't want anybody here to be intimidated by Harvard or anybody else telling you X, Y, and Z. They basically accepted some presuppositions that were handed down from them from previous generations, and they've just gone with them wildly, I think. But anyway, we'll talk about it here as we walk through and just give you some hard kind of facts to grab onto, and we can discuss with some detail. So at the end of the day then, what are we really asking? And if the allegation that you see in the Da Vinci Code and then some of these other scholarly is that this whole assumption, this whole presupposition that what you have in these four selections of the Gospels was a political decision, that it was motivated by all kinds of things. And I think in the end of the day, we do have to admit that a decision had been made. At some point, somebody had to decide which books were authentic. And we've shown quotes throughout the talk here where early church fathers and theologians and church leaders did, in fact, say these are the authentic books and these are not. So I think we can agree that at some point a decision was made, and in fact it turns out multiple decisions were made over multiple decades or even centuries as to which books are authentic. The question was, are those decisions justifiable? In other words, are they really just accidents of history? Are they politically motivated? Or did they have very good reasons for making the decisions that they made? And so that's really the question I think is underneath all of that. And that's really what we have to get at. So when you're in these discussions with other folks and the allegation is made, well, some people just picked the books that were in there, I think you can say, well, I think that's true. There were decisions made about which books are in and which books are out. The question is not whether that happened. The question is whether those decisions were justifiable and what was the basis for those decisions. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and kind of show you where we've been, kind of up to this point maybe, and then go forward then and then leverage that and talk about what does that mean with regard to these other Gospels. So in earlier classes then, we've kind of began to address this question of whether the decisions that were made over that time, whether they were in fact justifiable decisions. And one of the things I want to point out that writers in that era that immediately followed the apostles, they expressed a clear intention to capture the authentic witness of the apostles. I mean, they were clear and explicit about what they were trying to do. And so we've given several examples, but let me just, for the sake of just more clarity and more weight, just point out to you a couple examples, and I list them here in the notes. The first one was from Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, dated somewhere around 180 AD, his work against heresies. Already there was kind of different versions, if you will, of Christianity springing up, and so this bishop was trying to push back and argue against some of these variant versions of Christian theology. And he says quite explicitly, he makes this point that it is not possible that the Gospels can either be more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones in the world in which we live, east, west, north, and south, and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout the whole world, and the pill in the ground of the church is the gospel and the spiritual life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars, breathing out immortality on every side and vivifying men afresh. Here was somebody who believed so strongly in the foundation of the 4 gospels, he saw it in nature. So this was not a topic up for discussion by Irenaeus. It was built into the fabric of nature that there should be 4 Gospels. Apparently he didn't read Luke chapter 1 that says there were many originally, but he definitely thinks that this is the pillar on which earth means. Not maybe a very scientific argument, but it certainly shows how strongly by Irenaeus' time there was an assumption that there were 4 Gospels. And to me that's important. What that says, within 150 years of Jesus' death, there was an assumption that there were 4 Gospels, and these 4 Gospels were the pillars on which the church is based. It's an indirect testimony to that fact. So arguments that are made that these decisions about the Gospels and the inclusion of the canon were later, that they were done under Constantine in the 4th century, Council of Nicaea or whatever they claim, this is way late, way late. We know within 150 years from this statement in particular that there was a firm conviction among at least a large majority of the people in the faith that there were 4 Gospels. Now, there were other people making counterclaims, but the point here being that it was not a late decision, it was an early decision, and the folks that wanted to introduce other Gospels had to push against a well-established fact that there were 4 Gospels settled. And just to be a little kinder to Irenaeus and maybe see a little more reasonableness in his thinking, he isn't always the nicest of speakers here. Notice his quote here, and it's rather long, but I will read through it because I think it's an important contribution. He said, "These things being so, all who destroy the form of the gospel are vain, unlearned, and also audacious." Like I said, not very scholarly. Those, I mean, who represent the aspects of the being of the gospel, either more in number, as the aforesaid, or on the other hand, fewer. The former class, that is, that there are more, that they may seem to have discovered more than is of the truth. The latter, that they may set the dispensations of God aside. In other words, fewer number of gospels that they want to do that. And he quotes here, and I won't read this part, but he quotes Marcion. Marcion was one of those early thinkers that wanted to reduce all Judaic influence upon Christianity. And once you take all the Jewish influence out of Christianity, you are left with a very small amount left because so much of it forms out of the heritage of Jewish thought. But if we go forward here in this quote, if you'll see here, let's see. Wretched men indeed who wish to be pseudo-prophets, and he's talking about some of the Gnostics, in other words, who on the account of such come in hypocrisy hold themselves aloof from the communion of the brethren. So in other words, he's saying there are also people who are rejecting it, a substantial majority of folks that have accepted it. We must conclude, moreover, that these men, the Montanants, cannot admit the Apostle Paul either. For his epistle to the Corinthians, he speaks expressly of prophetical gifts and recognized men and women prophesying the church. So he's talking about people who have different motives for excluding things. And he says, but those those who are from Valentinius being, on the other hand, altogether reckless, while they put forth their own compositions, boast that they possess more gospels than there really are indeed, and they have all arrived at such a pitch of audacity so as to entitle comparatively recent writing the gospel of truth, though it agrees in nothing with the gospels of the apostles, so that they really have no gospel which is not full of blasphemy. What he's saying is that there are people in his own day who are writing gospels, and that they're trying to pretend they have equal authority. So we have indirect witness again to say that by Irenaeus' time, so 150 years after the death of Christ, there are other people still writing gospels who are trying to claim that they had the same authority as the gospels that are already being accepted. So it's an interesting witness. Then I list out for you a person by the name of Eusebius, who writes the first substantial church history that we have. I won't read this whole thing to you, but again, this is before Constantine, before Council of Nicaea, and so forth. If we look at the last paragraph, if you turn to the end of the notes, you'll see a note there which says, let's see. Oh, let's start with number 6. Let me start with number 6. He says, "But we have nevertheless felt compelled to give a catalog of these also, distinguish those works which, according to the ecclesiastical tradition, are true and genuine and commonly accepted, from those of which, although not canonical but disputed, yet are in the same time known to most ecclesiastical writers. We have felt compelled to give this catalog in order that we might be able to know both these works and those that are cited by the heretics under the name of apostles, including, for example, such books as the Gospel of Peter, of Thomas, of Matthias, or any others beside them, and the Acts of Andrew and John and the other apostles, which no one belonging to the succession of ecclesiastical writers has deemed worthy of mention in his writings." So again, by 300, we see Eusebius listing out all these other books and saying there are frauds out there. There are people writing things out. But the thing to notice here is it's not like they're just listing out other books in differentiation from the books that were received. The point is that there was a received corpus by this time. There were books that were accepted, and these are alternatives. These are ones that are added later. So all of this testimony, which is used out there in scholarship to point out, look, see all these different varieties of Christianity were out there? No, I don't think that's exactly what's being said. What's being said is there's an authentic received tradition of 4 Gospels, and there are all these other things trying to be added to it, and they're false and phony, and everybody gets that and understands that. So again, I realize this is just one person's opinion here, but I just wanted to point out to you, when you hear some of these scholars on TV and so forth reading quotes like this, trying to make the point that there are other competing gospels, I just want you to think a little bit deeper and realize that no, what we have here is a foundation of 4 Gospels which other people are trying to add to and supplement to, and these other writers are pushing back and saying, no, we already have it. It's a foundation that's already established. So again, the distance between Irenaeus, 180 AD, and Eusebius, so another 120 years, see, it's that same tradition of 4 Gospels that they find competition with. All right? So I just wanted to point that out. So I guess what I was saying to you, and then if you add to these quotes, I just gave you a couple, but if you go back through your notes from previous classes, you will see all kinds of references to the fact that these folks are trying to find the original witnesses. They're trying to get back to the original apostles. So if you're going to argue that these other gospels are just as authoritative, basically you have to take all those statements from all those church historians and ancient church witnesses and say, when they are saying they're trying to get back to the apostles, they're either lying or they're deluded. And I just find it much easier for me to accept these ancient witnesses are so much closer to the fact than modern people millennia later saying, yeah, they're liars or silly. I'm like, yeah, I'd rather accept that ancient tradition of people saying, no, we're working very hard to get back to the original tradition of the apostles. The other point I want to make along that line is when we look at the early listings of the books, which we have set out in past classes. I won't take time to do that again in the interest of time. But none of these early lists list anything other than the 4 Gospels. I mean, from the very beginning, from the earliest lists we have, there are 4 Gospels. And every time these other Gospels are mentioned, like what we have here, they're always mentioned as being outside the pale. And I don't care how good the early church or whatever the early authorities were, I doubt that they could burn every single book, every single list everywhere so that we could never come up with a different list. I mean, essentially speaking, these are the 4 Gospels. There's never a 5th one added. The closest that we come, and I'll talk about it in a moment, is Jerome, when he was doing his work for the Vulgate in the 4th century, says that he ran into a tradition of a book called the Gospel of the Hebrews, which certain sects at the time believed was the original version of Matthew, that it was written in Hebrew. And it was the original version of Matthew. So he said he heard about it, but he didn't have a copy of it. He didn't pass down a copy to us. So that's the only example we have of somebody who thought there might be another gospel out there. But he didn't include it in the Vulgate, and he didn't really even have enough of it to do. He just understood that it to exist. So apart from that, there's really no other gospel ever listed anywhere other than the 4 Gospels we have. So it's really, I think, a burden of proof goes to the folks who want to argue that other Gospels are just as authentic, to say, well, show me a list somewhere where these Gospels were actually recognized. These other Gospels are found, as we're going to find, mostly in a community in Egypt among a select group. So there might be a select group that read these books, but they're never found anywhere in any official list of what is in the Scriptures. So the other thing I would say is with regard to manuscript evidence. We looked last week at how many manuscripts there were for these different Gospels. The 4 Gospels have manuscripts all over the place. They're located and discovered everywhere in hundreds and hundreds of copies, whereas these other Gospels, they're down to just a few copies here and there in isolated places. So the manuscript evidence seems to suggest, for as long as we can find it, that it's really these 4 Gospels that were copied and distributed throughout the known world, not these other Gospels. These seem to be very, very restricted and used by just certain communities in certain areas. They don't seem to have a wide distribution. They're known about, speculated about, but they don't seem to be, they certainly weren't copied and passed around as frequently and as often as the other New Testament books. There're just not enough copies found. And lastly, last week, and this again, in some ways I realize it's a repetition of last week's class, but we talked about how the interdependence of the Gospels show that they dealt with a common tradition. I mean, you look at so much of the Gospels that relied upon each other and many times are repeating similar words and almost word for word some of those stories. And the clear witness that shines through from the Synoptic Gospels, those 3 Synoptic Gospels, is that they were working from a common historic tradition. So again, that is not the case with some of these other Gospels, as we will find out. They're very disparate in terms of their claims, not a lot of collaboration between them, giving witness to one another that they have an accurate tradition. So again, these are just some preliminary responses. Preliminary responses to the general allegation that there's no distinction and that these Gospels were, in fact, the 4 that we have were picked. Yes, they were picked or they were decided upon, but for very good reasons. The reason is that the collective judgment of the church is these are authentic witnesses to the actual apostolic tradition. They are the words of Jesus. They are the words of John and Peter and Andrew and the other disciples. These are faithful witnesses. And I would argue that it's much more logical to assume these 4 Gospels survived the test of time, were distributed to the extent they were copied to the extent they were translated to the extent they were, precisely because of all the other candidates out there. These 4 stood the test of time as being accurate and genuine witnesses to the original Jesus. It wasn't an accidental occurrence of some political decision. It was a universal decision by many people looking at many documents over a period of decades and centuries, that in the end they come to the decision that these are in fact the genuine witnesses to the apostolic tradition. So those are just some preliminary responses to that general statement as to why we have those first four Gospels and not additional ones. And if during question time you want to raise some more of that and I can get into more detail, I will. But I just wanted to kind of arm you with some basic approaches to that challenge. Now let me just kind of continue tonight with the next step of that argument. And that is, what about these other candidates? I mean, let's look at them. What are the other candidates for inclusion in the canon? When were they written, so that we can have that debate about time? Do they range alongside the Gospels as we have them? And should they be included? So let's do our due diligence here, at least give some consideration and look at what some of the other Gospels are and whether they should in fact be included. So immediately then we're asked, well, how many are there? How many legitimate other candidates were there in the early church that we can look at and examine? Let me just say up front that it's very debatable. The numbers range widely because we don't have copies of all of them. There's just mentions of many of them, and so we can't really tie them to actual documents. Moreover, some of the documents that we have and some of the manuscripts that we have, there's debates about whether they are part of the same work or whether they're different works entirely. And so scholars go after that. I don't know who has time to go through all that. I certainly don't. But they actually analyze these fragments and try to make the academic decision whether there's one document or two documents represented by these fragments. So let me just say up front that there is no hard and fast number. There's various numbers that are put out. We just read in the Da Vinci Code 80. That just seems to be entirely made up and fanciful. I mean, there's really no reason to pick the number 80. I think that purely is a work of fiction. It's just a number that was picked out of the air. But you do find 60 of them listed in that highly reliable internet encyclopedia called Wikipedia that people kind of just contribute to with no real authority to do so. They list 60 of them and give names attached to them. An interesting possibility, but it's probably not that many that were even raised at that time. That's every list known to man, every thing made in every article. So somebody's just doing a good book report there. On the other hand, there is some scholarly kind of lists that maybe have different texts. Ehrman, one of those folks I told you about before, he actually, before he kind of went off the deep end into all this speculation, he actually did some good New Testament work early on in his career. And he did do some pretty good scholarly work to list out 47 of them in this book called Lost Scripture. And I think that probably has a little better contention, although not all of them were ever serious candidates. They're just lists of other books. I think we're probably better in the area of 15 or 20. And this kind of... and I listed some things from the New Advent. It's a Roman Catholic encyclopedia. But what they've done is, I think, a better job of listing out what are the legitimate candidates. In other words, gospels that through the history of the church were actually alleged at the time to be valid gospels. And so that's probably closer to the number. But again, I mean, how do you number the number of candidates? So I just wanted to make you aware that it is a debatable number and there are various opinions there. Let's kind of go then. Let me just kind of set us up before I look into the actual examples of some of these gospels. Let me just set us up with some preliminary concepts, notions. A great cache of these gospels, which kind of created this resurgence of other gospels being on public television and discussed, was this find in 1945 of this collection of some 52 texts in Hammadi in Egypt. And it seems to be a cache of texts of a particular community known as Gnostics, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But there seems to be a concentration of this mystical kind of faith that happened and occurred in that general area. And it was found in 1945. So many of the Gospels that are alleged as being alternative sources, especially by Pagels and some of these other folks, come from these texts. In fact, Elaine Pagels, her kind of claim to fame was being one of the first people to get a hold of the Gospel of Thomas and also the Gospel of Judas. And she was actually one of Kester's students, and kind of came out of that interested in the Gnostic Gospels, and so a lot of studies went into that. So I just wanted you to be familiar with this term Nag Hammadi. You'll see it out there on the internet, and it is associated with a lot of the other Gospels. Now, the key to this part is the dating of these manuscripts. Now, I said to you earlier, last week, one of the real shocking things to some of the liberal scholars is when we found early copies in the New Testament that date to the beginning of the 2nd century. We have that that fragment from the Gospel of John that maybe can be dated to 125, 130 AD, something like that. That's a shock to some of these early liberal theologians who pretty much assumed that the New Testament, at least the majority of it, was written in the 2nd or 3rd century. If you think the 1st century goes from 0 to 100, the assumption was that the Gospels that we have now were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They were written much later, probably in the 2nd or maybe even as late as the 3rd century, some people argued, but at least after 100 AD. Well, when you find a fragment from the Gospel of John in 125 or 130 AD, then clearly, and you find it way down in Egypt, I mean, you clearly, this gospel has been written and copied and distributed much longer than that. And so this created something of a stir in that early period. Like, what do you do? See, if you're going to reject the Gospels that we have in the Scriptures, you have to date them later. I mean, you can't really assume that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have to assume they were written later than that fact. Well, see, now, if you want to argue that the Gnostic Gospels are just as legitimate, then that's fine if they're in the late 2nd century or early 3rd century, because you're assuming that the canonical Gospels are written at the same time. But what happens if you have proof that the actual Gospels that we have in the Bible were written earlier? Well, then what you have to do is you have to start arguing that some of these Gnostic Gospels were also written earlier. And so what's interesting, in the last decade or so, you have some of these writers originally who are willing to accept late dates for these Gnostic Gospels. You'll see them arguing more and more for earlier dates for these Gnostic Gospels so that they can rival the dates of what is more and more genuinely accepted. So it's just an interesting trend, a lot of debates, and it's not totally objective reflection on the dates of these. It tends to be this ongoing battle to argue that these Gospels that we have in Nag Hammadi are appropriately or approximating dates similar to the canonical Gospels. Although, quite frankly, you read some of the writings sometimes, and even Pagels and some of these folks will tell you that Mark was the first Gospel, and Matthew was next, and Luke was after that, but then they'll, of course, say, even though that may be the case, it's still relatively late in their writing, and that they have no historical basis. So I just wanted to let you know, as you research, there is a lot of debate about when these Gnostic Gospels are written, and a tendency of late to actually try to date them earlier so that we can see them as a rival. The other thing I wanted to let you just give you a little primer on is a lot of these Gospels that we're going to look at, or candidates for being a gospel, come from a tradition known as Gnosticism. And you will see this term thrown around a lot in the study of early Christian thought. The problem is it's very, very difficult in some regards to define. It's really, the starting point for the whole thing is it comes from this Greek word that it means knowledge, and it tends to talk about someone who knows. It tends to be a secret knowledge. I mean, that's about as far as we go in terms of the meaning of the word. But the problem with defining is it doesn't seem to refer to a particular sect or a particular community. It's really kind of a general movement. It's just a general approach, a general philosophy that really infects many movements over many generations. And so it's not like you can find a founder of Gnosticism. It's not like there was the first Gnostic. It really was kind of a set of assumptions, a general approach that found its way into all kinds of early Christian movements. There's some kind of common themes that are there, which I'll kind of list out for you here. There's this idea that matter is inherently evil. In the Gnostic way of approaching things, everything everything that exists, is inherently evil. And so, where those forms of Gnosticism affirm a God or a supreme being, there's this irreconcilable distinction between the supreme being who is spirit and the material world. The material world is evil, destined for destruction. There is this supreme being who is total spirit. And so it's a real dualistic kind of thinking here about the distinction between spirit and nature. So as a result, anything created, anything that has matter, is evil. And so the way the world gets created is that God himself, the Spirit, did not create the world because the Spirit is against matter. So there's this intermediary kind of being called the demiurge that comes along and creates. And so God did not create the world. A demiurge created the world, and some lesser being created the world. So that's just a normal, and what you usually see in Gnosticism as you read through it is it kind of, through a series of ages and through a series of acts, aeons they call them, the world eventually came to be from this demiurge. And so there's a staged creation, if you will. At the end of the day, then, what you have is a real marked dualism. There is on and off, being and non-being, matter and spirit, soul and body. Everything is just, there's a real distinction. And where that affects the human being is the body then becomes totally worthless and totally meaningless. And so the whole point of your life is to escape this body. The body is the thing that weighs you down. The body is the thing that separates you from God. The body is the thing that needs to go away. And so there's a very negative view of the body. And this can go in one of two directions. Either you become very, very ascetic, so you try to suppress and master your body, or because the body doesn't matter, you can be very licentious and do all kinds of things that you want to do, because in the end it doesn't matter, because the body is the body, and you focus on the soul. So how then did you escape the body and reunite yourself to the soul? Well, there is this whole idea of ascent of the soul. This idea that through some sort of secret knowledge imparted, you disengage from the body, and through a period of reflection, you emerge and work your way up. Now, different kinds of Gnostic kind of flavored schools talk differently about this ascent of the soul. Different ways to escape your body and reunite with the Supreme Being. In many cases, it's kind of a direct, intuitive, visionary kind of thing. In many cases, it's very eclectic and only certain people get it. It's not for everyone. There's a disdain for the general populace. Only the select few are given the wisdom and the insight to see directly these things. And you'll see some of these themes crop up in the Gospels as we untangle them and walk through some of these candidates. It's an interesting kind of debate that goes on out there as to the origins and nature of Gnosticism and its relationship to Christianity. But for a long time, it was assumed that Gnosticism was kind of a corruption of Christianity. In other words, that Christianity came first, and Gnosticism was kind of a mystical interpretation of it. And they do that because most of the early works that we found talking about Gnosticism were Christian writers writing about it. And in fact, one of the first kind of, shall we call them, heretics of the church was this fellow by the name of Marcion, who was very definitely a Gnostic fellow. And in fact, he created one of the first crises in the church with regard to the canon of the New Testament. I mean, the first thing, because of this dualism, if you will, between the difference between the spirit God and the material world, basically, as a Christian, so to speak, he decided that the Old Testament was about the demiurge. The Old Testament was about the God who created the world. That wasn't the real spirit God. The Old Testament was about the demiurge, and so that was irrelevant to the Christian life. He just get rid of the Old Testament altogether, right? And then he looked at the New Testament and he says, okay, what here in the New Testament was corrupted by the Old Testament? Well, 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, all seem to be thoroughly corrupted by the Jewish perspective on things, and so he accepted only Luke because it had less, in his mind, less Jewish influence. And then he got to Luke and he cut out all the passages that referred to Judaism, and that was what was left for him, this one gospel. Then he went through the letters to Paul, cut out everything related to Judaism from the letters of Paul, and decided he had a little bit of Romans left, a little bit, a couple other things, and that was his Bible. And so he's kind of the first kind of Christian liberal, if you will. And what you find in the early church is this, just this rampant attack on Marcion, saying, "What are you doing? This is not the tradition we received." And so, kind of that's where kind of a lot of the attention to Gnosticism comes from in the early church. Well, as of late, and I guess I say as of late, it's actually been around again since the 30s and the 40s, if not before that. This acknowledgement that there's probably a tie between Gnosticism and some of the more Eastern ways of thinking. It even ties to Buddhism. If you know Buddhism, the first principle of Buddhism is life is suffering, right? And the reason it is because we have this attachment to things out there. Is desires at the heart of this. And so there's been all kinds of attempts, I won't get off on that, but to link Gnosticism with Buddhism and this whole rejection of matter and being. So anyway, I just want to put that out there to give you a little acquaintance and a little orientation, because you're going to see some of these themes emerging. Okay, with the time we have left, let me just jump into some of the texts that are kind of sometimes affirmed, and what I've done in each case is I'll give you a little overview of them, and then we have a few texts, and I won't have a chance, obviously, to read all the texts for all the sources here. You can do that on your own, and I will say that in every case, everything that I've put here, you can definitely go home on the internet, look it up, and you can read the whole thing for yourself. And just to be clear, because sometimes you have to say these in a church environment, I don't regard any of these as scripture, and I'm not urging you to regard any of them as scriptures. I just am putting them out there for you to look at so that you're aware of what we're talking about, and as people are raising them. One of the ones that is offered, quite frankly, or quite often and quite frequently, I should say, as an alternative view of early Christianity and a rival to the Gospels that we have, is this Gospel of Thomas. This was one of the Nag Hammadi texts that were found in Egypt in 1945. It's in the Coptic language, which is a form of ancient Egyptian. The text that we have is the full text that we have is actually dated after Constantine, so it's a late. But we found some fragments of it going back to 200. It probably was composed around 200, something of that nature. Although, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are some scholars out there are trying to argue for an earlier date so that it looks like a rival to the New Testament. What you have in there are 114 what we call hidden sayings. And in essence, underneath the Gospel of Thomas, what's being argued there is that these were sayings that were spoken by Jesus to his disciples, and they're viewed as kind of the select few. If the whole point of behind Gnostic thought is that you need this secret knowledge to get escape from your body and escape to a higher being. Then you need this secret knowledge. And so Jesus there is viewed as kind of this Gnostic teacher that will unlock the secrets of the universe. And interestingly enough, as you read through these 114 sayings, you will see many of them that sound roughly similar to things that you already see in the Gospels. Then, of course, the assumption is, well, then obviously the writer of the Gospel of Thomas probably borrowed from the New Testament. That's what you and I would say. To the scholars that are out there, they see it as, the liberal scholars out there see that kind of as a competing source of some of these other texts. But in any case, when you read through it, you'll see a lot of reflection. What we do know, even the folks that would kind of purport this as a rival gospel, even they acknowledge that the one thing we know for sure is Thomas did not write this. It receives the name Thomas because the opening line in the gospel just reads in this text, says, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and did him as Judas Thomas recorded." The feeling here is that, what you normally, when you think of Thomas, you think of what? Doubting Thomas, right? And so the thinking is that Thomas was not so much a doubter of truth, but really he was a holder of secret truth. And on the outside, he appeared to doubt, but in reality, he had the essence and the truth. And you'll see this also in the Gospel of Judas that we're going to talk about in a minute here. That idea that on the outward, you look like you don't know what you're doing, but on the inside, you hold the secret. All right? And that's really what the point here. Again, there's some argument as to whether the text we have is the text that referred to. Eusebius and other places is probably referring to this Gospel of Thomas as we now have it. So we know that this was around at least in 300 AD, at least we suspect it was, because it is referred to as one of those heretical Gospels, if you will, that Eusebius saw. Just to look at some of the quotes from the Gospel of Thomas here, notice he says, and he said, and these are all straight quotations, and he being Jesus here, and he said, "Whosoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." So again, this idea that if you have the secret knowledge, you will be able to escape death. And there's the other thing that you see in these sayings, there's some weird stuff in here. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. One of the things I would challenge you to do is read through this stuff and say, does this make... I mean, I know there are hard sayings in the gospel, but nothing crazy like this. Read this next one. Jesus said, "Lucky is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human. And foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion will still become human." That's a little odd, isn't it? I mean, this whole idea of the difference between matter and spirit. And so there's no distinction between, any kind of flesh. It's all animal flesh. It's just the same. And so it's this idea that the spirit, the human spirit, in order to be truly human, has to liberate itself from the flesh. It's just a really weird saying. And clearly doesn't give you the same picture of Jesus that you see in the Gospels. This statement here, this is, the conversation with Thomas there, and I just put that one in here. It says, "We know that you're going to leave us. Who will be our leader?" And now here's where we find out why it's James. It says, Jesus said to them, "No matter where you are, go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." So that's an unusual statement about James the Just. We have now an understanding of why he becomes the leader of the church, because it's referenced here. And another interesting saying, Jesus says to his disciples, "Compare me to something and tell me what I'm like," which is an interesting little conversation. Simon Peter said to him, "You are just like a messenger." And Matthew said to him, "You're like a wise philosopher." But Thomas, who is the truly wise one, says, "Teacher, my mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like." all right, because he's the truly wise one. But Jesus says, I am not your teacher, because you have drunk and you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring that I have tended. He took them and withdrew and spoke 3 sayings to them. When Thomas came back to his friends, they asked him, what did Jesus say to you? And Thomas said, if I tell you one of these sayings he spoke to you, you will pick up rocks and stone me, and fire will come from the rocks and devour you. So there is this, and you're going to see the same thing in the Gospel of Judas, this idea that Jesus is kind of laughing at his disciples. This idea that they really never understood. And so he picked one out of all of them to share this special knowledge. And in this one it's Thomas, and in the other one it's Judas. But it's a common theme in these Gospels that it's one disciple, and the other ones Jesus kind of looks down on, and kind of even in the Gospel of Judas he even laughs at them because they don't get it. And then this one, Jesus said, if they say to you, where have you come from? To say to them, we have come from the light, from the place where the light came into being by itself, established itself, and appeared in their image. If they say to you, is it you? Say, we are its children, and we are the children of the living Father. If they ask you, what is the evidence of your Father in you? Say to them, it is motion and rest. In other words, this idea that God is not matter. He's pure spirit. He's pure energy. And this whole idea of light and darkness, this is a theme that you see throughout the Gnostic thinking, that there is this light. I should probably pause for a moment and just point out that there's been a lot of speculation about the relationship of Gnosticism to the Gospel of John. And in fact, a lot of comparison between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas, and the question of which came first for those who don't believe that John actually wrote his Gospel. And what I would say to you is, in fact, sometimes John is referred to in some more scholarly circles as the Gnostic Gospel. And I would just say to you that John is not really Gnostic in any sense. There's nothing about John that's Gnostic. Now, he uses contemporary Greek thought. He uses words like logos, and he talks about light and darkness. And what I would suggest to you is that while John uses a lot of thought that's kind of words that are common to Greek philosophy of the day, they're not Gnostic ideas. He was not a Gnostic. Quite the reverse. He is always talking about how God is redeeming the world. Christ is redeeming the world, how Christ came in the flesh. I mean, he's very affirming of the creation and that God is there to redeem it. So I would just caution, when you hear someone telling you John is a Gnostic gospel, I would push back pretty hard. Because just because he uses words like light and darkness and some of those things, he's not a Gnostic in any sense of the word. Well, I'm looking at the clock here. I realize I probably shouldn't spend more time doing this. There are two little, at the end though, I do want to point out two things that the last two are kind of significant in some ways. This idea that you actually drink from Christ's mouth. I mean, this theme comes up often in these Gospels, and you see that in 108. And the last one is an interesting one that gets it into trouble sometimes, and in fact to the point that some people argue that maybe it wasn't even in the original Gospel of Thomas. But Simon Peter said to them, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." That might be a slightly controversial thing to say. But what you will find in the Gnostic Gospels is that there tends to be more of a respect and more of an interest in the female's role. One of the reasons why the Gnostic Gospels are so popular, especially among, I hate to say it, women scholars, is because they see the Gnostic Gospels as being kind of an antidote to the patriarchal Gospels that they believe are in the New Testament. The male-dominated hierarchy that was part of the regular church, they believe that's one of the reasons why these Gnostic Gospels were kept out of the church, is because they are so supportive of the value of women and the value of women in ministry, and so they see one of those political decisions of ruling these out is because they're not because of the patriarchal leadership. Things like this don't sound to me to be especially affirming of females, but I mean, certainly this assumption that they are more engaged. The other part that maybe I didn't talk to you about Gnosticism is this whole notion of Sophia, wisdom. That's a feminine concept. And so, this idea that the wisdom, the feminine spirit kind of pervades us, that also contributes to the strong feminist kind of, or at least affirming notions there. All right, well, let me go to the other important one, and I'll try to, like I said, we're not going to get through all of them. I'll try to make sure I leave enough time for questions, but I do want to cover a couple of the most controversial ones. Let me talk about the Gospel of Judas. I don't know, this one's of more recent popularity because it really, though it's been around for a while, it really only got translated and put out there in 2000. It is a really fascinating story, discovered in 1970s, but went through all the back channels of the market, the antiquities market, and oddly enough ended up in somebody's safe deposit box in Hicksville, New York. And out there is just how it makes the journey. You can't make this stuff up. But Pagels actually tells a very interesting story, how somebody tried to contact her to get engaged in translating, and then suddenly went silent because they realized they couldn't sell it because it was stolen. So it's just an interesting, it's just a fascinating story to trace this thing through. But eventually it surfaced. It also debates about when it was written, probably 2nd century. And you read that through, and it's a really fascinating story of this conversation that goes on between Judas and Jesus, this secret conversation. And of course, in traditional Orthodox thought, as we read through it in the Gospels, Judas is the bad person. I mean, he's the one that betrayed Jesus. But in this version, in the Gospel of Judas, that is not the case. What the conversation is between Jesus and Judas, and Jesus thinking this whole idea of him dying is actually his idea. And Judas helps him in all this. And the whole point of it is, now again, keep in mind, if the flesh is not important, then death is an insignificant thing. And so the argument in the Gospel of Judas is, I'm going to go, Jesus is saying he's going to go, he's going to give himself up. He's going to give up his body because he's going to go back and be with the Father, and Judas is going to help him in that. So in this version of the story, Judas is a willing participant in Jesus' decision to give up his body. And so in this version, Judas pretends to be a betrayer, but in fact is helping Jesus execute what Jesus in fact wants to do. And the foil are the other disciples, which again, throughout the story, Jesus is laughing at them. And at the end of the day, the problem is that Judas is then viewed as a betrayer, and unlike the biblical story as we have it, that went out and hung himself, in the Gospel of Judas, the other disciples stoned him because they thought wrongly, in the opinion of Judas, the Gospel here, that he was betraying Jesus when all along he was supposed to be enabling him. So obviously what the real interesting kind of perspective on all this is, it totally does away with this idea of the atonement of Christ as a sacrifice. I mean, that is totally out of this document. The whole point of the document is to reinterpret the death of Jesus, not so much as an atoning sacrifice, but rather as an example of disengagement from the body and a willing detachment of the body and a learning of secret language that will help your soul ascend to be with the Spirit. So it's a thoroughly Gnostic view of salvation, which really has little to do with the biblical claim. Let me do a couple more, and then we'll break for questions. I realize now I probably should have been a little more concise on my upfront comments so I could talk a little bit about more. Another one you'll hear from time to time is this Gospel of Mary. It's one of the oldest ones found in the 19th century. It's been around, again, probably to the 2nd century. There's large chunks of it we don't have, but it claims to be a secret conversation, again, between Mary and Jesus. And in this gospel, there's just all kinds of, it's a long, and I think I pretty much put the whole thing that we have here. It's just a story of that ascent of the soul. Another idea, how do you escape from the body and be reunited with the Spirit Father. And the last one I guess I don't know if it'll be the last one. But the next one I want to talk about briefly is the Gospel of Philip, and I only want to bring this up because it's, in the Da Vinci Code, it's one that apparently was used to make some of the claims that it makes. It's also one of the Hammadi texts. This one's probably later, maybe 3rd century, although again debated. It doesn't really claim to be by Philip. The reason it gets the title, the Gospel of Philip, because Philip is really the only, the primary apostle that's mentioned, and it kind of mentioned once there. And it's also, as we're going to see as I look through some of these texts, it's kind of the primary source for this speculation of this relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. Let's see. Just skipping down, I have some quotes here. I won't have time to go through them all, but just if we skip down to the third quote there, notice what it says. It said, "Some said Mary conceived by the Holy Spirit. They are in error. They do not know what they are saying. When did a woman ever conceive by a woman? Mary is a virgin whom no power defiled. She is a great anathema to the Hebrews, who are the apostles and the apostolic men." This fascination with Mary and this immaculate conception. How was Jesus created? In other words, does he have a body? Is he a real physical being? Like, how does this happen? And it's this idea that even in the Gnostic view of Jesus, Jesus was appearing to be a man. He was appearing to have a body. He was not really a physical being because, again, matter is evil. And so I point this out to let you know that one of the early struggles of the church, and one of the reasons why there is such a debate, not only about the Gospels, but against Gnosticism, is this whole idea of the nature of Christ. I mean, that's the first major doctrinal crisis of the early church. Who is this Jesus? I mean, is he God or is he human? From a Jewish perspective, there is only one God, so now how can Jesus be God, right? So immediately you have a problem there. And from a Greek perspective, there are many gods, so why is Jesus the only God? And so you have these two competing theological perspectives that now the early Christians are in this place of having to define, who is this Jesus? How can he be both God and human? Well, the Gnostic answer is he appears. The Docetic answer, if you will, it's kind of similar, another kind of heretical view, this idea that he appears to be truly human. Well, I just wanted to show you that that's in Philip as well. And you see it in this next quote. "Those who say that the Lord died first and then rose up are in error, for he rose up first and then died." And the idea is he can't have this denial of the physical resurrection because, again, Jesus can have an actual body. Let me just take you to the last couple quotes here. Let's see. If you turn the page to the next series of quotes on the back of Philip, I just want to show you a couple quotes about Mary Magdalene. This is where that whole rumor comes about. This statement from the Gospel of Philip: "There were three who always walked with the Lord, Mary, his mother, and her sister, and Magdalene, the one who is called his companion." And some of the early English translations rendered this word here, lover. It's probably better rendered companion, but obviously if you render it lover, it creates a different interpretation there. "His sister and his mother and his companion were each a Mary." And it was just noticing that the three close companions of Jesus, female, had the same name. And then there's the second statement, "As for the wisdom who is called the barren, she is the mother of the angels. And the companion of and then there's some missing words, Mary Magdalene." And then this ellipsis, which again indicates missing text, "loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth." So again, this is kind of where that comes from. The problem with that text is A, we're missing a bunch of it, and B, you have in the back of it all this Gnostic imagery of Jesus, this kiss being an image of his impartation of knowledge. This idea that he's breathing his secret knowledge into her. So again, A, it has no historical value in our opinion, but what you and I would see as a rather abrasive, romantic inclination, if you read Gnostic literature, all that kissing, that romantic notion, that interplay between man and woman, and even sometimes even sexual imagery, is all about this interaction between the spirit and the flesh, and this impartation, not the spirit and the flesh, but this impartation of spirit from one person to another. It's such an intimate experience of the transfer of knowledge. So my point is, those couple quotes are pretty much the basis upon which this rumor about Jesus and his affair with Mary Magdalene started. It's pretty flimsy, if you ask me. But again, what's to stop speculation? Why do you have to have facts? Why complicate the matter but have to have facts? Just wildly speculate and get it published. That's the best answer, right? So anyway, just very flimsy kind of evidence. So with that in mind, I realize I've left only 10 minutes for questions. I'll leave it to you to kind of read through the rest of these. I'll just flip through quickly and see if there's any. The last one here is this one of Hebrews that I mentioned to you, which again we don't have. But let me just switch to the last screen. We'll do the conclusions and then we'll take questions. And again, I just want to repeat here in conclusion that these Gospels can really only be taken seriously if we assume that the four canonical Gospels were also written in the 2nd century. I mean, once you accept if you can believe based on the evidence we went through last week, that those first four Gospels were in fact written in the 1st century, then you can't really take these other Gospels seriously. I mean, unless they're written about the same time, and that these canonical Gospels were written later, then really you can't really take them seriously. So consequently, the scholarship out there will always try to argue that the canonical Gospels are a little bit later. There's the four Gospels we have were a little bit later, and that these Gnostic Gospels were a little bit earlier. I mean, that's the way scholarship is kind of going. And again, I just want to repeat, you saw that the majority of these were found in Hammadi. There's just a few scraps to show us that these things exist. There was no universal acceptance of any of these Gospels as authoritative in any way. And the other point that it seems to me is we're back to where we started. If we accept these as legitimate expressions of early Christianity, I mean, I have no problem accepting these as witnesses to a particular tradition in early development. But they really have no historic value for telling us who Jesus is. These are just interpretations or philosophical speculations using Jesus as a character. I mean, they really have no value to tell us historically who Jesus is whatsoever. And so I don't see in that regard how they're good news, how you can really call them gospel. I mean, they're not gospel to me if they don't give me anything other than more philosophical speculation. What makes a gospel is that it's good news. And the reason it's good news is because God has broken through and with his own Son. If you take that out of the equation, then it's just another philosophical speculation. And the value of the Gospels we have, and I believe the reason why the Gospels sustained over all these generations, even the millennia, and the reason why they stand today as legitimate witnesses is not an accident of politics or culture. It's because they bear witness to the gospel, the good news, that Jesus made flesh among us, who continues to heal and raise and save and be a power, and that is why the Gospels are the Gospels. And so that's why in every case I refuse to put the word gospel next to any of these. They were always in quotes, because they're not good news if they're just another philosophy. So that's my conclusion. So, well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll take some questions. Father, thank you so much for this opportunity to at least look at some of these early texts and just get a handle on them, so that when not only when we wrestle with it in our own soul and we watch these shows and read these magazine articles and read these books and we start to question our assumptions, that now at least maybe we have some handles to get a hold of this stuff, but also as we discuss it out in the marketplace, so we're not totally taken off guard, and we can at least ask intelligent questions and maybe poke some doubt into some folks out of there. And again, realizing we're not going to save anybody. You're the only savior of humankind. All we can do is help to clear the bushes so that people can see Christ. And so, Father, we lay this task into your hands as you work through us. And thank you in the name of Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.